He bought an abandoned orphanage, then discovered something no one could believe to this day. The children's shoes were still lined up by the door, 43 pairs, from tiny leather boots to scuffed-up work shoes for the older boys. But here was the strange part, the truly unsettling part. Every single pair was perfectly clean, as if they had just been polished by 43 children right before they vanished forever. Hiram Sinclair stood in the cavernous, silent hallway, the deed clutched in his hand. This was supposed to be his simplest purchase yet, a derelict property on the edge of the territory, perfect for his new hotel. The seller, a nervous man with shifting eyes, swore the building had been vacant for 20 years. 20 years of dust and decay. But he was lying. The faint smell of fresh-baked bread still hung in the air, a phantom scent that had no business being there. And the dust? It wasn't a thick, even blanket. It was disturbed. There were clean squares and rectangles on the wooden floor, ghosts of furniture that had been moved just recently, not decades ago. Something was terribly wrong with the story he'd been sold. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the main office. The air inside was stale, heavy with secrets. A thick leather ledger lay open on the director's desk, its pages filled with elegant, looping script. Hiram ran a finger over the final entry. The ink was still dark, not faded by time. It was dated just 3 months ago. Final transfer complete. All records relocated. May they forgive us for what we had to do. But that was impossible. Every official document, every county record, stated that the Radcliffe Home for Unwanted Children had closed its doors in 1865, 20 years earlier. The building was supposed to be a tomb, a memory. Instead, it felt like a crime scene that had just been wiped clean. He lifted the ledger, and his breath caught in his throat. The pages beneath weren't blank. They were scarred. Someone had written on the page above with so much force, so much desperation, that the words were pressed deep into the paper below, ghostly impressions left behind. He angled the page toward the grimy window, the fading afternoon light revealing fragments of a secret story. Separated from brother. False name given. Final payment received. The orphanage hadn't just been keeping records, it had been keeping 2 sets of records. One for the world to see, and one that held the terrible truth. A cold dread, heavy and sharp, began to creep up his spine. This wasn't just a simple property deal anymore. He had stumbled into something dark, something that had been deliberately buried. He walked through the long, silent dormitories, and the questions began to pile up like storm clouds on the horizon. Every iron frame bed had been stripped bare, the thin mattresses stark and white. But underneath one of them, tucked away in the shadows, he found a child's drawing. It was made with charcoal on a scrap of brown paper. 2 stick figures holding hands, one taller than the other. At the bottom, in the shaky, uncertain letters of a child just learning to write, were 4 gut-wrenching words. Find my sister Mary. Who was Mary? And who was the little artist who had left this desperate plea behind? In another room, he found more secrets. He stumbled on a loose floorboard near the wall. When he pried it up, the stench of stale air and fear hit him. On the underside of the board, someone had carved tiny marks into the wood. Not just a few, dozens of them. Hundreds, grouped in sets of 5, with a final slash through each set. Someone hadn't just been counting days here. They had been counting years. A prisoner, marking time in the dark. But the most disturbing discovery, the one that made his blood run cold, was waiting for him in the damp, musty basement. It wasn't filled with old furniture and forgotten toys. It was a storeroom, an archive of stolen lives. Wooden crates were stacked to the ceiling, each one labeled not with a name, but with a number. He pulled down the nearest one, box 847. His fingers trembled as he pried open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was a little girl's dress. It was simple, made of faded blue cotton. Next to it was a small, folded note. The handwriting was the same precise, cold script from the ledger. Age 7, brown hair, quiet disposition, suitable for Western Territory placement. Payment received in full. The children hadn't been adopted. They hadn't been given new homes. They had been sold. Sold like cattle. Hiram dropped the note as if it had burned him. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the stone walls pressing in, the air thick and hard to breathe. He had come here to build a hotel, a place of comfort and luxury. Instead, he was standing in a warehouse of human souls, surrounded by the evidence of an unspeakable crime. Box after box lined the shelves, each one a ghost story. A worn-out teddy bear, a single tiny shoe, a book of fairy tales with a child's name scribbled inside, only for the name to be violently scratched out. Each crate held the last pieces of a child's life, reduced to a transaction, an inventory note. He stumbled back upstairs, his mind reeling. The whole orphanage looked different now. The details he'd missed before were screaming at him. Tiny scratch marks on a door frame, at the height of a small child, as if desperate fingers had clawed at the wood, trying to get out. Windows that had been nailed shut from the outside, not the inside. A massive kitchen with serving bowls big enough to feed an army of children, but the stacks of plates and cups numbered far, far fewer. The math didn't make any sense. If 43 pairs of shoes belonged to 43 children, where were the plates for 43 mouths to eat from? It was a stage, a performance, and somewhere the audience had been applauding. Back in the office, a frantic energy took hold of him. He tore through the desk, pulling out every drawer, searching for more. Behind the very last drawer, wedged tight against the back panel, his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. It was old, the creases worn thin. The handwriting was completely different from the ledger. It was shaky, desperate, the ink blotted in places as if from tears. They are taking the children west, not to families, to work. The buyers pay more for the young ones, the ones who won't ask questions or remember their real names. I tried to stop it. I tried to tell someone, but I am just one person against so many important men. If someone ever finds this note, please know that we tried to keep their real identities safe. The truth is hidden where only the children could reach. The note was signed with 2 simple initials. C.B. Hiram's eyes shot around the empty office, where only the children could reach. It was a riddle. He wasn't looking for a safe hidden behind a painting. He was looking for a child's hiding place. He dropped to his knees, his hands running along the baseboards, the low wainscoting, the space beneath the heavy desk. In the far corner, almost completely hidden in shadow, his fingers found it. A section of the wood paneling that felt different. It moved just slightly when he pressed it. He worked his fingernails into the seam, prying and pulling until a small panel, no bigger than a book, popped free. It revealed a dark, hollow space inside the wall, and nestled within that space was a small tin box. It was heavy for its size, heavy with the weight of the secrets it held. He had just lifted the box out, its cold metal a shock against his skin, when he heard it. The slow, groaning creak of the orphanage's front door swinging open. Footsteps echoed in the long hallway. They weren't his footsteps. They were slow, heavy, deliberate. The steps of someone who knew this building intimately. Someone who had walked these halls 1,000 times. Someone who had come back for something they had left behind. The footsteps were coming directly toward the office. Hiram's heart hammered against his ribs. He shoved the tin box deep into the pocket of his coat and scrambled to push the wooden panel back into place, praying it looked undisturbed. He was a fool. He should have been more careful. He was trespassing on more than just property. He was trespassing on a conspiracy. The footsteps stopped. Right outside the office door. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, menacing silence, filled with unspoken threat. Then a voice cut through the stillness, a woman's voice, sharp and cold as ice. I know someone's in there. The voice was old, brittle with age, but it held an iron core of authority, the kind of voice that expected and received instant obedience. This building has been closed for 20 years. You have no right to be here. Hiram took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He stepped into the doorway, trying to look like a man who belonged there. He found himself face to face with a tall, severe woman in a faded black dress that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Her gray hair was pulled back in a mercilessly tight bun, and her pale blue eyes were as hard and unforgiving as chips of stone. She had seen things, she had made decisions, and she lived with them without a shred of regret. "I'm Hiram Sinclair," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I bought this property 3 days ago." He pulled the deed from his pocket, the paper a flimsy shield against her piercing gaze. "And you are?" The woman's expression didn't so much change as it settled. A mask of cold civility dropped into place. "Susanna Radcliffe. I was the director here, until unfortunate circumstances forced us to close." Her eyes, those cold blue eyes, flickered past him, scanning the office, taking in the open ledger on the desk. She knew. She knew he'd been digging. "What exactly are you planning to do with my building?" she asked, a possessive tone in her voice. "Turn it into a hotel, I presume." "That's the plan," Hiram said, watching her carefully. "Though I admit, I'm becoming more curious about what happened here. The history. The previous owner was rather vague about the details." Susanna let out a laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was sharp and bitter, like breaking glass. "I'm sure he was. Some stories are better left buried, Mr. Sinclair. This place has held enough pain for one lifetime." She glided into the office, a predator returning to its hunting ground. Her long, bony fingers traced the edge of the desk, right next to the ledger. "You've been reading our records, I see." "Just trying to understand the operation you ran here," Hiram countered, the weight of the hidden box in his pocket feeling heavier by the second. "We provided a home for unwanted children," she said. The words were smooth, polished, rehearsed 1,000 times. "We gave them food, shelter, and opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Not everyone appreciated our methods, of course, but the results speak for themselves." Hiram thought of the note signed CB. He thought of the boxes in the basement. He thought of the words "payment received." What kind of results were those? Susanna's eyes narrowed, the cold blue hardening into something dangerous. The kind that kept children fed and clothed instead of starving on the streets. "Sometimes, Mr. Sinclair, the perfect solution isn't available. Sometimes you must make compromises for the greater good." "Compromises?" Hiram pushed, unable to stop himself. "Compromises like separating brothers and sisters?" The question hit its mark. A tiny crack appeared in her icy composure, a flicker of something dark and violent in her eyes. She had not expected him to know that. How do you know about that?" "I found things," Hiram said, stepping closer, pressing his advantage. "Down in the basement, boxes, children's belongings, notes about their placements, notes about payments." He lowered his voice. "What really happened to those children, Miss Radcliffe?" She was silent for a long, heavy moment. Her fingers drummed a frantic, silent rhythm on the old oak desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, menacing whisper. "You should be very careful, Mr. Sinclair. Be very careful about asking questions you don't truly want the answers to. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Just then, from outside, came the nervous whinny of a horse. It sounded close, just beyond the walls. But when Hiram glanced out the grimy window, the courtyard was empty. There was no horse. The sound came again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of hooves on packed dirt. Hiram moved to the window and saw her. A woman was dismounting from a big chestnut mare. She moved with a fluid, confident purpose, tying the reins to the old iron hitching post as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She wasn't just visiting. She was arriving. Expecting someone? Hiram asked, turning back to Susanna. The director's face had gone chalk white. All the color drained from her, leaving a mask of pure shock and fury. That's impossible, she breathed. She wouldn't dare. She wouldn't dare come back here. The front door of the orphanage flew open with a resounding bang that echoed through the empty halls. Rapid, angry footsteps were coming down the hallway, coming fast. A moment later, a woman in her 30s burst into the office. Her brown hair was escaping from a simple braid, her riding dress was covered in dust, and her eyes were burning with a cold, controlled fire that had been simmering for years. She ignored Hiram completely. Her gaze was locked on Susanna Radcliffe. "Hello, Susanna," the newcomer said, and her voice was filled with a decade's worth of controlled rage. Susanna's voice was barely a whisper. "I see you're still playing your little games, Margaret." "You shouldn't be here," Susanna hissed. "Margaret Emerson." The woman, Margaret, finally turned to Hiram. She extended a hand, her grip firm and strong. "And you must be the man who bought this cursed place." Hiram studied her face. It was a face carved by hardship, but her dark eyes were sharp, intelligent, and alert. She was ready for a fight. "You two know each other," Hiram said, stating the obvious. "Oh, we know each other very well," Margaret said, her gaze snapping back to Susanna, cold and hard as steel. "She sold me when I was 7 years old. She told my new owners that my parents had died in a wagon accident, that I was an orphan, lucky to be taken in by such a fine, upstanding family." Susanna drew herself up, a flicker of her old authority returning. "You were given opportunities you never would have dreamed of. An education. A comfortable home." "My parents weren't dead." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a razor. "They spent 15 years searching for me. 15 years believing their only daughter had been taken by wolves or drowned in a river. They died of broken hearts, still not knowing what you did to me. What you did to our family." Hiram felt the solid weight of the tin box against his chest. It felt like it was burning a hole in his coat. "How did you find out the truth?" he asked. "Caleb told me," Margaret said, her eyes glancing around the familiar office. "Caleb Boone, CB. He worked here as a groundskeeper, a quiet man who saw everything. His conscience finally got the better of him. He kept records, Mr. Sinclair. Secret records of every single child who passed through these doors. Their real names, where they came from, and where Susanna sent them." Susanna took an involuntary step backward. "Caleb is dead. He's been dead for 3 years." "But his records aren't," Margaret said with a grim, tight smile. "He hid them well, didn't he? It took me months to find them after he passed. He left me a letter. He told me to look for the truth where only the children could reach." Hiram's hand instinctively moved to his coat, to the hidden box. Margaret's eyes followed the movement, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. "You've been here before," Susanna accused Margaret. "Snooping around." "Several times," Margaret confirmed. "I've been documenting everything, gathering evidence, building a case." She strode to the desk and opened the official ledger, flipping through the pages with a practiced ease. "You see these numbers here, Mr. Sinclair? These aren't adoption file numbers. They're coordinates, locations. We thought they were families, but they weren't. They were work camps, mining operations, places where small hands and small bodies could fit into tight spaces where grown men couldn't." "That's enough!" Susanna's voice was sharp, a whip crack of authority. "You have no proof! Only the wild accusations of a disgruntled girl and the ramblings of a dead man." Margaret turned slowly to face her former captor. "Don't I?" She reached into the leather saddlebag she'd been carrying and pulled out a thick folder, overflowing with papers, photographs, and letters. She slammed it down on the desk. 47 children, Susanna. 47 that Caleb documented. I've managed to find 23 of them so far. 23 survivors who are willing to talk. The room fell silent. The only sound, the loud, rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. A sound like a bomb counting down. And what I discovered about the other 24? Margaret said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, is going to destroy you. Margaret spread the papers across the desk with deliberate, theatrical precision. Hiram stared at the photographs of children. Some were smiling, their faces full of innocent hope. Others stared at the camera with haunted, empty eyes that seemed far too old for their young faces. They were the eyes of children who had seen the worst of the world. These 24 were different, Margaret continued, her finger tapping on one particular photograph of a young boy with a defiant look. They were older when they arrived here, old enough to remember their families, their real names, old enough to cause problems, to ask too many questions, to try and escape. Susanna's breathing was shallow, ragged. You don't understand the pressures we were under. The territorial government provided no funding. We had to find alternative solutions to keep the doors open. Alternative solutions? Margaret laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Is that what you call it when a child disappears from the face of the earth? When there's no record of where they went, who took them, or if they're even still alive? Hiram could bear it no longer. He pulled the cold tin box from his coat and placed it on the desk between them. Both women fell silent, staring at it. Caleb left this behind the wall panel, Hiram said. I think it has the answers about those 24 children. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition. That's his emergency box, his final proof. He told me about it in his last letter, but he never said where he hid it. With a desperate cry, Susanna lunged forward, her hands like claws, trying to grab the box. But Margaret was faster. She caught Susanna's wrist in an iron grip. No more secrets, Susanna. It all ends today. Hiram's fingers trembled as he worked the small latch on the box. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect them from the damp, were dozens of small tin-type photographs and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal fell open to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. At the top of the page, in Caleb's neat, careful handwriting, were 2 words, "The disappeared," and below that, a prayer. May God forgive us all. The page was filled with names, ages, and dates. And next to each entry was a location, a destination that made Hiram's blood turn to ice in his veins. Copper Canyon Mine, Shaft 7. Silver Creek Excavation, deep tunnels. Mountain Ridge Operation, dynamite work. They sent them into the mines, Hiram whispered, the words catching in his throat. They sent children into the mines. The dangerous jobs, Margaret confirmed, her voice grim. The ones adults wouldn't risk. Small bodies could crawl through collapsed tunnels that would crush a man. Little hands could place explosive charges in crevices too narrow for grown-ups. And if something went wrong... She gestured to the photographs, to the list of names. No one would ever know they existed. No family to ask questions. Just another nameless, forgotten casualty of progress. Susanna finally found her voice, a high-pitched, desperate sound. It was necessary. Those mining operations provided jobs for hundreds of families in this territory. It was for the greater good. A few sacrifices had to be made. Sacrifices? Margaret's voice rose to a shout, echoing in the silent office. They were children. They had names. They had families who loved them and dreams of their own. Hiram, sick to his stomach, turned to the last page of Caleb's journal. What he found there made his hands shake so violently he could barely hold the book. It was a map, hand-drawn in ink on a piece of parchment. a map of the surrounding territory, and scattered across it were dozens of small black X's, unmarked graves. At each location, there was a number that corresponded to a child in the journal. Caleb found them, Margaret said quietly, her anger replaced by a profound sadness. He spent his last years documenting where they were buried. He said the least he could do was make sure they weren't completely forgotten, that someone knew where they were laid to rest. Susanna was backing away now, her eyes wide with panic, her composure completely shattered. She was an animal caught in a trap. You can't prove any of this. Those records are forgeries. Caleb was unstable in his final years. Everyone knew that. He was senile. Margaret smiled a cold, merciless smile and pulled one final document from her folder. She held it up for Susanna to see. That's where you're wrong, Susanna. This is a signed and notarized confession from the mine foreman at Copper Canyon. A man who finally grew a conscience. He kept his own detailed records. Records of every child worker who died in those tunnels. Records with names that match Caleb's journal perfectly. She let the paper flutter onto the desk. The confession is dated 2 weeks ago. He's still alive, Susanna. And he is very, very willing to testify against you and everyone else involved. Susanna's face twisted into a mask of pure rage and desperation. She lunged, not for the box this time, but for the confession in Margaret's hands. Margaret stepped back swiftly, clutching the papers to her chest. You have no idea what you're destroying, Susanna shrieked. This orphanage saved more children than it lost. The mining work gave those troublemakers purpose, discipline. They would have ended up dead on the streets anyway. Purpose? Margaret's voice cracked, the raw emotion finally breaking through. Tommy Brennan was 8 years old when you sent him to Copper Canyon. 8! Caleb's journal says he died setting explosive charges because his hands were the only ones small enough to reach the tight spaces. That's not purpose. That's a death sentence. Hiram was looking closer at the photographs from Caleb's box. Each child's face was a story of innocence betrayed. But as he flipped through the small tintypes, he noticed something else. Something that twisted the knot in his stomach even tighter. These aren't all orphans, he said quietly. Both women turned to look at him. Some of these children, they're too well dressed when they arrived, too healthy looking. They had families who cared for them. He held up a photograph of a little girl with carefully braided hair and a clean lace-collared dress. This child wasn't abandoned on your doorstep. She was taken. Margaret snatched the photograph from his hand. Her face went pale. She recognized something in the blurry background. That's outside the general store on Main Street. I remember that day. I was there. There were stories back then. Children disappearing right out of town. Parents swore their children had been kidnapped, but the sheriff always said they must have just wandered off into the woods. Susanna laughed, that same bitter broken glass sound. Sheriff Caldwell knew exactly what was happening. He was paid very, very well to look the other way. Just like Judge Morrison. Just like half the officials in the territorial government. You foolish children. Did you really think an operation like this could run for 20 years without protection from powerful and important men? The revelation hit Hiram like a physical blow. This wasn't just a corrupt orphanage. It was a conspiracy that went to the very top. How many people were involved? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Enough, Susanna said, moving toward the window, her eyes calculating, looking for an escape. Enough to make sure no one ever asked uncomfortable questions. The mining companies needed workers. Wealthy families out in California wanted servants. Everyone got what they wanted. Margaret grabbed Susanna by the arm, spinning her around with surprising strength. Everyone except the children. They got unmarked graves. Some died, yes, Susanna snarled, jerking her arm free. But many lived comfortable lives, better lives than their dirt-poor parents ever could have given them. I gave them opportunities. Hiram was flipping through Caleb's journal again, his eyes scanning for any other clues. He found a page he'd missed before. Written in thick red ink, as if marked for special importance, was a list of names under the heading, Current Operations, Still Active. The blood in his veins turned to ice as he read the first entry. New facility established 50 miles north, disguised as a mission school. Current inventory, 23 children. Next shipment scheduled for month's end. It's still happening, he whispered, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. It's not over. Margaret grabbed the journal from his hands, her eyes flying across the page. Where? Where is this other facility? Susanna's expression shifted again. The desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, triumphant satisfaction. She knew she had one last card to play. You're too late to stop it. The final shipment leaves tomorrow morning. 23 more children, gone forever. Just like all the others. She reached into a hidden pocket in her dress and pulled out a small, ornate brass key. But I might be persuaded to tell you the location. For the right price. And my freedom. Just then, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the empty courtyard. Not one horse this time. Several. Susanna smiled, a cold reptilian smile. Ah, it seems my associates have arrived just in time. 3 men on horseback rode into the courtyard, their faces hard and weathered by the sun and cheap whiskey. The leader, a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his vest, dismounted with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who is used to being in charge. A man who was the law. Margaret breathed the name like a curse. Sheriff Caldwell! I should have known. The sheriff and his 2 deputies approached the orphanage entrance. Through the window, Hiram could see the cold calculation in the man's eyes. This wasn't a rescue. This was a cleanup crew. You called for help, I see, Hiram said grimly to Susanna. Oh, she did more than that, Margaret said, her eyes still glued to the journal. Her face was pale with a new horror. Look at this entry. From last week. Sheriff Caldwell confirmed transport route clear. No interference expected from territorial authorities. Susanna's smile widened as heavy boots stomped onto the front porch. I told you, this operation had protection. The sheriff has been ensuring our smooth operations for 15 years. The front door creaked open, and Caldwell's voice boomed through the hallway. Susanna, you said there was some trouble in here? Sheriff! She called out, her voice sickly sweet. Thank heavens you're here. We have some visitors, trespassers. They've been asking the most inappropriate questions about our former residents. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, a mountain of a man, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. His eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The scattered papers, the open journal, the photographs spread across the desk like fallen leaves. Well now, he drawled, his voice deceptively friendly. Looks to me like we have some folks who don't understand the complexities of territorial child welfare. Margaret stepped forward, her chin high, her eyes blazing with defiance. Oh, we understand perfectly, Sheriff. We understand that you've been an accomplice to the kidnapping and murder of children for profit. Those are strong accusations, Missy, Caldwell said, his tone still mild, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a winter sky. I hope you have more than some old papers and wild theories to back them up. Hiram clutched the tin box tighter. It was all in there. Names, dates, locations. Enough evidence to see every single one of them hang. But with the sheriff and his men controlling the exits, that evidence might never see the light of day. They would disappear, just like Caleb Boone, just like the children. The territorial governor will be very interested to see what we've found here, Hiram said, bluffing, praying his voice sounded more confident than he felt. Caldwell laughed, a deep, ugly sound that filled the room. Governor Harrison? Son, He's the one who suggested we expand the operation northward. He has a vested interest in the mining companies. Those children you're so concerned about? They're being put to productive use. Better that than letting them starve on the streets, right? Margaret's face had gone ghost white. You're all monsters. We're practical men, Caldwell corrected her, making practical decisions in an impractical world. Susanna moved to stand beside the sheriff, a loyal lieutenant beside her king. And now, the sheriff continued, his eyes locking onto Hiram and Margaret, we need to make another practical decision about what to do with two witnesses who know far too much. One of the deputies stepped into the room, a young man with nervous eyes, blocking the only other exit. The second deputy remained by the front door, a silent guard. The trap had been sprung. Hiram's mind raced, searching for an escape, an advantage, anything. The evidence was damning, but it was worthless if they were buried in an unmarked grave next to the children they were trying to save. He thought about the map in Caleb's journal. He thought about the confession from the mine foreman. He thought about the bluff that was their only chance. Before you do anything irreversible, Hiram said, his voice slow and careful, you should know that copies of all these documents have already been sent to the territorial capital. It was a complete and utter lie, a desperate shot in the dark, but it was the only card he had left to play. Sheriff Caldwell's friendly expression finally vanished, replaced by a dark, thunderous scowl. Is that so? Margaret, quick as a flash, caught on. 3 copies, actually, she added, her voice ringing with false confidence. 1 to the governor's political rivals, 1 to the head territorial marshal, and 1 to a particularly ambitious newspaper editor down in Denver who loves a good scandal. The room fell, deathly silent. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Susanna's confident smile began to waver. Caldwell's eyes darted between Hiram and Margaret, trying to read them, calculating the odds, weighing the risk. The silence stretched on, a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. Caldwell's gaze was intense, trying to burn the lie out of them. You're bluffing, he said finally, but for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty clouded his voice. Margaret stepped closer to the desk, her hand resting protectively on Caleb's journal. Am I? Ask yourself this, Sheriff. How do you think I found this place after all these years? How do you think I knew exactly when to arrive? Do you think this was all just a coincidence? Hiram seized the thread of the lie and wove it thicker. We've been planning this for months, Sheriff. Margaret made contact with the marshal's office weeks ago. They're already quietly investigating reports of missing children in 3 different counties. Your name has come up. More than once. It wasn't entirely false. Margaret had been writing letters, documenting cases for years, but they were stretching the truth as thin as a spider's web. Susanna's composure finally cracked for good. You can't prove anything, she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. Those children were better off. They were. Better off dead? Margaret's voice was a whip. I found the grave sites, Susanna. Caleb mapped every single one. She snatched the journal, opened it to the hand-drawn map, and thrust it toward Caldwell. 37 unmarked graves scattered across your territory. 37 children who died in cave-ins, explosions, and so-called accidents that never would have happened if you hadn't sent babies to do a man's dangerous work. The sheriff's eyes scanned the map, his face growing paler with each black X he saw. This proves nothing. Mining is a dangerous business. Accidents happen. Not to 8-year-old children, you monster. Margaret's fury was a physical force in the room. Not when those children should have been in a schoolhouse, not placing sticks of dynamite. Hiram saw it then, a flicker of movement by the door. The younger deputy, the one with the nervous eyes, was shifting uncomfortably. The young man's face was a mask of growing horror as he listened. He wasn't one of them. Not completely. Deputy Morrison, Hiram said, addressing the young man directly, his voice calm but firm. Is this what you signed up for? Did you know what you were protecting? Did you know about the children? The deputy's hand, which had been resting on his gun, moved away. I thought we were just keeping the peace, he stammered. Nobody told me about any children. Shut your mouth, Morrison, Caldwell snapped, but his authority was crumbling, the foundations cracking under the weight of the truth. Margaret seized the moment, pressing the attack. How many more children have to die for your profit, Sheriff? Right now, as we speak, there are 23 more children at your new facility. 23 children waiting to be shipped off to the mining camps. Children who will be dead within a year if we don't stop you right now. The second deputy, the one guarding the front door, spoke up. Sheriff, if what they're saying is true... It's not true, Susanna screamed, clawing at the shreds of her story. They're making it all up. Caleb was senile. His records are worthless. But Hiram had found one last thing in the tin box, the final damning piece of proof. He held up a small tin-type photograph. It was a picture of a mining camp, with the tiny, blurry figures of children working near heavy, dangerous-looking machinery. On the back, in Caleb's meticulous script, were the words, Copper Canyon, 1874. The last photo taken before the explosion. Only 2 survived. Caleb documented everything, didn't he? Hiram said, his voice low and steady. Every crime, every death, every single cover-up. The room fell dead silent as everyone stared at the damning image. And then, from outside, came a new sound. The sound of many horses, approaching fast. But these weren't more of Caldwell's corrupt cronies. Hiram could see them through the window now. A dozen riders moving with grim, military precision. They were territorial marshals, led by a stern-faced man with federal credentials pinned to his dusty coat. Margaret's bluff, it turned out, hadn't been entirely a lie after all. Marshal Davidson! Margaret called out as the lead rider dismounted, her voice ringing with relief. Perfect timing! Sheriff Caldwell's face went completely ashen. He looked at Margaret, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hatred. Margaret! What have you done? What I should have done years ago, she said. She walked past the stunned deputies, met the marshal on the porch, and handed him Caleb's journal and the photograph from Copper Canyon. I sent a preliminary report to the territorial capital 3 weeks ago, Marshal. Your office has been investigating the missing children reports ever since. Marshal Davidson studied the evidence, his expression growing harder and colder with each page he turned. He looked up, his eyes like flint. Sheriff Caldwell, you and your men are under arrest. For conspiracy, child endangerment, and multiple counts of murder. You can't prove murder, Susanna protested, her voice a desperate squeak. Those were accidents, tragic accidents. Ma'am, the marshal said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. We found the northern facility yesterday afternoon. We found 23 children living in conditions that would shame a prison warden. And that mine foreman you found, Miss Emerson. He has provided a full, signed confession in exchange for clemency. He remembers every single name. Relief, pure and absolute, washed over Hiram. The children, are they safe? They're safe, the marshal confirmed. All 23 are in protective custody. We're already working to reunite them with the families they were stolen from. He turned his cold gaze back to Susanna. Miss Radcliffe, you are also under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the marshals placed heavy iron shackles on Caldwell and Susanna, the corrupt sheriff made one final pathetic plea. You don't understand the economics of this territory. Those mines employ hundreds of people, the children. They served a purpose. The only purpose a child should serve, Margaret said coldly, is to grow up safe and loved. Deputy Morrison, the young man from the doorway, stepped forward. He unpinned his badge and held it out to Marshal Davidson. "Marshal, sir, I want to cooperate. Fully. I swear, I didn't know about the children, but I should have asked more questions. I should have seen it." The marshal looked at the young man, then at the badge, and nodded slowly. "Your cooperation will be noted, son." As the prisoners were loaded onto horses for the long ride to the territorial capital, Hiram stood in the empty orphanage one last time. The silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was just empty. The building would never be a hotel, but it had served one last vital purpose. It had given up its dead and revealed the truth. Margaret came to stand beside him in the silent office. "Caleb would be proud," she said softly. "His records, his courage. It saved those 23 children, and it will prevent this from ever happening again." "What will you do now?" Hiram asked her. "Continue the work," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. "There are other territories, other children who need someone to speak for them." She looked at him. "And you? Still planning on building that hotel?" Hiram looked around the room where so much pain had been planned and orchestrated. "No," he said. "No, I think this place should become something else. Something different. Maybe a school, a real one, where children can be safe and learn and just be children." Margaret nodded, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. Caleb would have liked that. As they walked out into the clean, fresh air together, Hiram realized that sometimes the most important purchases you make aren't about buildings or land. They're about the chance to right a terrible wrong, to give a voice to the voiceless, and justice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. The abandoned orphanage would soon be filled with the sounds of children again. But this time, it would be the sound of laughter, not tears. If you enjoyed this incredible story of justice and courage, click the video on your screen right now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and determination collide in ways you would never expect. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and maybe even leave a comment to let us know what you think. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue to bring these remarkable stories to light.